I had been staring at a blank page for hours. My fingers hovered over the keys, heavy with the weight of stories unformed and ideas that refused to breathe life. Writer's block wasn't new to me, but this time it was different. It felt insurmountable, like my mind itself had been locked away. Every morning, I woke hoping for inspiration to strike, only to find that my personal life, the parts one had been avoiding, had seeped into my work and choked it. Elias had always been the perfect partner on paper. I had convinced myself that his careful guidance, his polished advice, his sharp literary mind was enough to fill the empty spaces in my heart. But the words on the page, stubborn and resistant, whispered otherwise. It was in that frustrating haze of self-doubt that I noticed Elias's laptop, left carelessly unlocked in the living room. Normally, I wouldn't have glanced at it. I respected his privacy. But something in me, perhaps the hunger for any distraction from my own blocked mind, drew me over. The screen glowed with a document I had never seen before, Project Genesis. I assumed immediately it was a new manuscript collaboration with Genevieve. Elias often spoke of her brilliance, of the seamless way her mind danced with plot lines and character arcs. I didn't begrudge their professional relationship. I prided myself on being secure enough to respect the expertise of others. But something about the way the document opened, how it displayed a folder of detailed plans and outlines, made my pulse quicken in a way that felt off. I hesitated, fingers frozen above the trackpad. It was wrong. I knew it. But my curiosity, spurred by the gnawing anxiety of the words I could not find in my own novel, overcame me. I clicked. What I saw made the air leave my lungs. This was no manuscript. The document was meticulous, cold, precise. Page after page outlined a life that was not mine, a joint lease, a 5-year plan that revolved around Genevieve's family and career ambitions, and, most damning, a section titled Chapter 3, Section A with the note, "Send Freya the boilerplate breakup email." The betrayal wasn't flashy or passionate. It was surgical. It was calculated. Elias had planned every word, every step, every moment, treating my heart as a corporate project to be managed, monitored, and ultimately discarded. My mind spun. Images of our shared apartment, our carefully constructed routines, flickering like fragile paper in a storm. Every laugh, every promise, every late-night conversation now felt tainted. I sank into the chair, the cold leather pressing against my skin as a wave of nausea and disbelief overtook me. It wasn't just that he had plotted to leave me for Genevieve. It was that he had framed it like a business plan, a spreadsheet, a set of objectives to be checked off. I had thought I was safe, that my love and loyalty were enough. But safety was an illusion. The clarity, when it came, was shocking in its intensity. The document, this cruel, methodical outline, forced me to confront something I had been denying for years. I had allowed my life to be edited by someone else, my choices dictated by his convenience, my creativity smothered by his control. And in that moment, the frustration of my writer's block, the gnawing emptiness of a life half-lived, crystallized into a sharp, unshakable truth. I would not continue in this narrative. I would not allow my story to be dictated by a man who measured love like a ledger. I felt the rebirth like a spark lighting a fire. My voice, my real, untamed voice, was waiting. And I was done waiting for permission to claim it. I closed the laptop abruptly, heart still racing, hands trembling with a mixture of fury and liberation. The blank page no longer mocked me. It beckoned. I would write. I would write with all the anger, all the clarity, and all the life I had stifled. And I would do it on my terms. For the first time in years, I felt unshackled. The betrayal was a wound, yes, but it was also a revelation, a roadmap to freedom, a declaration that the author of my life was, and always would be, me. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of my study, but it brought no warmth. My hands were still shaking from the discovery of Project Genesis, and my mind spun through every possible scenario, every half-remembered conversation with Elias that suddenly seemed like part of a rehearsed script. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner, but the cruel efficiency of his planning was something I had never expected, and perhaps, in some way, refused to notice. I brewed a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl into the air, but the liquid didn't soothe me. Every sip was bitter with betrayal. My writer's block, which had once felt like a quiet frustration, now seemed a minor annoyance compared to the whirlwind of deceit that had been orchestrated right under my nose. I realized I had to investigate, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to see the full truth. My own clarity demanded it. I booted my laptop again, this time opening my email logs, cloud documents, and digital backups. I traced the metadata of Project Genesis. The file had been created months ago, revised daily, each update meticulously timestamped, each version saved under a new name. Elias had been mapping this out for months, treating my eventual heartbreak like a strategic operation. My stomach churned, a mix of fury and disbelief, as I scrolled through the edits, seeing Genevieve's initials and comments that were always polite but pointed, as if she were rehearsing lines in a play they'd both written for me without my consent. As I dug deeper, I realized the scope of their manipulation. The outline wasn't just about a breakup. It dictated my routines, my living situation, even decisions I thought were personal. They had woven a narrative where I was a character in their story, not the author of my own life. Each detail, our apartment lease, my scheduled professional engagements, even the timing of social events, had been considered, adjusted, and cataloged. The realization hit like a physical blow. Every assumption I had about his love, about our shared life, was a lie. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. This was more than emotional betrayal. It was a total erasure of autonomy. Yet, amid the anger, a sharp clarity emerged. I had spent years seeking approval, molding myself to fit a version of love and partnership that Elias could control. And now, faced with the cold logic of the document, I understood. I would never allow anyone to manipulate my life like this again. The thought of confronting him was tempting. I imagined standing in our living room, Project Genesis open on the table, demanding answers. But I knew confrontation alone would not restore my voice or my agency. I needed a plan, one that preserved my dignity and leveraged the undeniable evidence I now held. I needed someone who understood not only the professional landscape of publishing but also the insidious way Elias had weaponized it against me. That person was Professor Alistair. Even retired, he carried the gravitas and insight that could dismantle a career built on manipulation. He had always been my anchor in moments of creative doubt, offering guidance without expectation. If I was going to reclaim my story, both as a writer and as a woman whose life had been commandeered, I needed him by my side. I drafted an email, hands trembling, yet determined. I attached the document and summarized the situation, carefully omitting the rawest edges of my emotion. It was a professional, precise communication, my first act of control since discovering the betrayal. I paused before hitting send, inhaling deeply. This was the moment I reclaimed the narrative. Not through anger, not through vengeance, but through intellect, integrity, and the support of someone who respected the truth as much as I did. When I pressed send, a weight lifted, though the storm inside me had not yet calmed. I knew the path forward would be challenging. Elias was shrewd, his reputation strong, and his co-conspirator equally capable. But I also knew that for the first time in years, I was not navigating this alone. I had the document, I had the evidence, and I had someone who valued honesty as fiercely as I did. For the first time that morning, I touched the keyboard without hesitation. Words began to form, tentative at first, then faster, freer. My creative voice, silenced for so long under the weight of manipulation and expectation, was finding its rhythm again. And with each sentence, I felt my rebirth deepen, not as a victim of Elias's plans, but as the architect of my own life, ready to write a story that was truly mine. The moment I hit send, I felt a strange mixture of relief and tension, as if the air around me had thickened and yet, paradoxically, opened up. Professor Alistair's name appeared in my inbox almost immediately. His reply was succinct but carried the weight I had hoped for, I understand completely. I'll handle this with discretion. Trust yourself, Freya. You're stronger than you realize. Even as I read his words, I felt a nervous excitement building. Strong as I had thought I was, I had underestimated how much this betrayal had eroded me. Elias had been meticulous, his planning, the shared document, the careful mapping of my life. It all felt like a slow, invisible theft. Yet Alistair's calm confidence was contagious. For the first time since opening Project Genesis, I felt the possibility of action, not merely reaction. I spent the next hour retracing my steps, making sure I had all the digital breadcrumbs in place. Screenshots, metadata, timestamps, every detail was now organized, cataloged, and preserved. The cold, analytical part of me, the writer who thrived on structure and clarity, kicked in. If I was going to reclaim my life, I had to act like a strategist, not a heartbroken victim. Then came the thrill of anticipation. I imagined the chain reaction that would follow when Alistair, someone whose word carried immense credibility in the literary world, intervened. Elias had built his reputation on charm and cunning, but he had not accounted for a mentor who respected integrity over expedience. I picture his surprise when colleagues, editors, and literary circles began to question the ethics that had been his signature. My betrayal had not gone unnoticed, but it would now serve as the catalyst for justice. Despite my strategic planning, I could not ignore the personal weight of what I had discovered. My mornings spent drafting novels, my nights lost in imagined futures, all seemed tainted by the knowledge that the life I thought I was living was manufactured. Elias had choreographed our domestic moments, our shared experiences, as though I were a character in a meticulously plotted book, rather than a living, breathing human being. The realization was almost suffocating. But then I thought of Alistair, and something shifted. There was a quiet strength in him that had always drawn me, not in the flashy, performative way Elias had, but in a profound, stabilizing sense of presence. Even in his retirement, he maintained the same gentle authority that had guided me through earlier drafts, through moments of creative doubt. I felt a flicker of anticipation, a spark of something deeper that had nothing to do with manipulation or calculated charm. Perhaps, just perhaps, this betrayal would not only reclaim my agency, but also allow my heart to see what had been hiding in plain sight all along. I decided to take a break from the digital war. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked through the small, sunlit garden outside my apartment. The air smelled of early spring, sharp and promising. I let my gaze drift over the blossoms, the gentle curve of new leaves, and I felt my pulse slow. It was a grounding moment, a reminder that life existed outside the confines of documents, contracts, and betrayals. My creativity, my life, my choices, they belonged to me. No one could structure or edit them without my consent. As the evening approached, my phone buzzed again. It was Alistair, checking in, but there was a warmth in his words that reached beyond professionalism. Freya, you're handling this beautifully. Remember, creativity is not just in the page, but in reclaiming your own story. And you're doing just that. There was a subtle pause, almost a hesitation before he added, if you need guidance or company, I'll be around. My heart fluttered unexpectedly, a soft warmth spreading through my chest. The rational, calculated Freya I had become in the aftermath of betrayal was now accompanied by something new, curiosity, attraction, and perhaps even hope. I went back to my desk and opened my manuscript, the pages blank but waiting. For the first time in months, the words flowed, not forced, not blocked, but alive. I wrote about freedom, about autonomy, about embracing the life I had almost surrendered. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I imagined a future where honesty, intellect, and passion could coexist, not in a calculated outline like Elias had drafted, but as a genuine narrative of shared respect and care. By the end of the night, the manuscript had grown, my heart had shifted, and my spirit felt steadier. I realized that this was not only a professional rebirth, but a deeply personal one. And as I turned off the lamp and looked out at the quiet city lights, I allowed myself the smallest smile. I was not just reclaiming my story. I was ready to live it, and perhaps to share it with someone whose presence was as authentic and grounding as the words I now wrote. The morning sunlight spilled through my apartment windows, but I didn't notice it at first. My mind was still buzzing from the momentum of last night, the surge of clarity, the reclaiming of my story, and the subtle, unexpected warmth Alistair had sparked. I poured myself a cup of coffee and, almost instinctively, checked my inbox. There it was, a reply from Alistair, brief but precise, outlining the steps he had taken to quietly alert the literary community to Elias's ethical breaches. My pulse quickened as I read. Reputable editors, colleagues, and former clients had been informed. Elias's meticulously polished reputation was already beginning to crack. There was no satisfaction in malice. It was the inevitability of truth taking its course that filled me with a strange exhilaration. Elias had constructed a world where I, and perhaps others, were characters in his design. But now, with Alistair's intervention and my own careful documentation, that world was crumbling. Every calculated smile, every carefully delivered compliment, every feigned show of encouragement would now be viewed with skepticism. It was justice, quiet yet relentless, and I was finally on the right side of it. As I reviewed the timeline of events, I felt a flicker of self-doubt. Would my own credibility survive the exposure of Elias's manipulation? I reminded myself of the facts, the digital evidence, the meticulous record I had kept. There was no room for his spin. For once, clarity and truth were allies, not obstacles. My manuscript waited, patient and ready, just like me, as though the words themselves were breathing alongside my newfound resolve. Then I received a call from Alistair, and his voice, steady and warm, washed over me like a calming tide. "Freya, I'm glad you're safe," he said, and I realized that despite all the betrayal and tension, I was grateful for his presence in my life. His guidance had been more than professional. It was grounding, moral, and, unexpectedly, deeply comforting. He asked about my progress on the manuscript, and I found myself describing the characters, the narrative of personal liberation I was now embracing. He listened, offering insights that were never condescending, only encouraging. The professional turn of events began to spill into my personal life in subtle ways. Invitations to speak at literary panels, once deferred or dismissed by Elias, now arrived with urgency and respect. Editors who had once bypassed my pitches were suddenly interested, genuinely curious about my ideas. I felt the shift in energy around me, the recognition of my skill, and insight that had always been there but was previously overshadowed by Elias's influence. I realized that reclaiming my voice was not just a literary act. It was a statement of my autonomy, my worth, and my right to inhabit the world fully. Even amidst these changes, my thoughts often drifted to Alistair. There was a subtle tension in the air between us, a quiet pull that was not born of need or obligation, but of mutual respect and shared values. One evening, after a particularly productive discussion on narrative structure, he lingered at my desk longer than necessary. I could feel his presence behind me, steady, patient, and somehow reassuring. The scent of his aftershave, subtle and earthy, seemed to wrap around the room, blending with the scent of my old books and fresh ink. I turned slightly to meet his gaze, and for a brief, suspended moment, everything else fell away. No manuscripts, no betrayal, no professional scheming, just two people, fully present, acknowledging an unspoken connection. His hand brushed against mine as he gestured to a section of the manuscript, a touch light, fleeting, yet electric. My breath caught, and I realized I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth and authenticity I had almost forgotten could exist. That night, as I lay in bed, the city lights casting patterns on my ceiling, I felt the full spectrum of rebirth coursing through me. The betrayal, the strategic exposure of Elias, the mentorship and support of Alistair, it had all coalesced into a newfound understanding of myself. I was no longer a pawn in someone else's narrative. I was the author of my own life, writing it in bold, deliberate strokes. And somewhere in that new narrative, There was room for love that was patient, grounded, and real, not manufactured or calculated, but genuine, and perhaps just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, painting gold across my manuscript pages, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the familiar weight of self-doubt pressing against my chest. The betrayal, Elias's cold calculations, the digital outline of a life I wasn't meant to live, it was all behind me now. Behind me, but not forgotten. Every memory fueled the clarity that pulsed through my fingertips as I typed, each word a reclamation of my voice. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the quiet. There was a rhythm in writing about emotional liberation, about truth, about characters who dared to reject the false narratives imposed upon them. It mirrored the rhythm of my own awakening. Each chapter one completed felt like a small act of defiance, a quiet victory against the cage of expectation that Elias had constructed around me. With Alistair's guidance, my ideas no longer stumbled under self-imposed constraints. They soared, honest and untamed. Alistair called mid-morning, a soft chuckle in his voice as he asked about my progress. I recounted my morning, the breakthroughs in character development, the delicate arcs of emotional discovery. His encouragement was steady, never overbearing, never insistent. He offered clarity without pressure. There was a subtle intimacy in these conversations, a growing sense of trust that I hadn't allowed myself in years. I realized that with him, I didn't need to perform or temper my words. My authentic self was enough. By late afternoon, I decided to take a break and walk to the nearby park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of early spring, and the trees swayed gently, like the gentle cadence of a story unfolding naturally. As I walked, I thought about Alistair's presence in my life. It was comforting, grounding, and undeniably stirring in a way I hadn't anticipated. Memories of Elias, the calculated smiles, the meticulous plans, the cold detachment, faded further into irrelevance with each step I took toward freedom. I didn't expect to find Alistair there. He was sitting on a bench near the pond, a leather-bound notebook open on his lap, scribbling notes in his precise, elegant hand. His eyes lifted as I approached, and the corner of his mouth tilted into a smile that made my chest tighten with a mixture of warmth and longing. "Freya," he said softly, as if greeting an old friend rather than a collaborator. "I hoped I'd catch you here." I smiled, feeling a flutter I hadn't expected. "It's my favorite thinking spot," I said, walking closer. I needed some air after hours of staring at the screen. He nodded, and for a moment, silence settled comfortably between us. There was no rush, no performance, just a shared acknowledgement of presence. And then, as if the universe had shifted its rhythm, our hands brushed while reaching for the same notebook. The touch was electric, light yet filled with unspoken intention. My heart lurched, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn into the magnetic gravity that Alistair carried effortlessly. He tilted his head, studying me with that quiet, unwavering attention that had become so familiar. "You're incredible, Freya," he murmured, voice low, almost reverent. "Your words, they have a life of their own. I can see why Elias never understood them. He would have tried to control them, like he tried to control you." My throat tightened at the tenderness in his words, the recognition of all I had endured. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension of years of suppression drain from my shoulders. "I'm finally writing for me," I said softly. "Not for anyone else, not for their approval." He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His touch lingered, deliberate, warm. "And you deserve every word, every chapter, every moment of this liberation," he whispered. The moment stretched between us, heavy with anticipation and unspoken desire. I leaned into him, and his lips met mine in a kiss that was patient, knowing, and full of promise. It was more than attraction. It was a recognition of shared values, trust, and the rebirth of a woman finally free to claim her story, her voice, and her heart. As we parted slightly, foreheads resting together, I realized that my life, like my manuscript, was finally unfolding as it should, honest, daring, and fiercely alive. And for the first time, I felt the exhilarating certainty that this was just the beginning. The morning sun streamed through my window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I greeted it without anxiety pressing at my chest. My manuscript sprawled across the desk, filled with chapters that I had finally allowed to breathe, to grow wild and honest. Each word felt like reclamation, each paragraph a defiance of the cage Elias had built around my life. I sipped my tea slowly, savoring the quiet before the day's work began. Alistair had insisted I keep a strict writing schedule, but he never dictated my process. His guidance was steady, grounded in wisdom, not control. It was liberating to write with someone who understood the subtlety of patience, who valued insight over imposition. I pored over a chapter that depicted a protagonist confronting betrayal, and I realized with a shiver that every line echoed my own rebirth, my defiance, my reclaiming of truth. By late morning, a message from Alistair appeared on my phone. Lunch? I know a spot where the soup is as honest as the chef. I smiled, my fingers trembling slightly with excitement and anticipation. It wasn't just lunch. It was an excuse to step out of the isolation of my writing room and into the warmth of someone who had become both mentor and anchor. We met at the quaint bistro he had mentioned. The sunlight pooled around him, highlighting the gentle lines of his face, the wisdom etched in subtle ways that weren't just physical, but profound. I felt a flutter I hadn't expected, a tension between comfort and longing that only grew when he greeted me with that soft smile that seemed to see right through pretense. As we walked through the city streets, he held the door for me, and our fingers brushed. The contact was electric, subtle, yet undeniable, a whisper of something more. I felt my heart race, a mix of anticipation and desire, a hunger that had nothing to do with physical needs and everything to do with emotional recognition. Alistair understood the language of quiet intimacy, the delicate negotiation of touch and attention that could ignite without overwhelming. Lunch was light, conversation flowing effortlessly from plot points to character arcs and then veering into laughter over literary absurdities. And through it all, the proximity between us simmered, each glance and brush of hand layering into a subtle tension that neither of us rushed to resolve. It was exhilarating. The anticipation, the knowledge that this connection was grounded in trust, intellect, and shared ethics. As we stepped back into the sunlight, our hands met again, this time intentionally. His fingers threaded through mine, grounding me even as my pulse leapt. I looked up at him, and he leaned close, his voice low and intimate. Freya, I've seen the depth of your soul in these words. And I need you to know, I've been captivated not just by your mind, but by the heart behind it. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a mixture of exhilaration and vulnerability. My breath caught, a thrill of desire and connection. I stepped closer, emboldened by the honesty between us. His hand moved from mine to the small of my back, a gentle, possessive touch that made my knees weaken slightly. I tilted my head, our lips meeting in a kiss that was tentative at first, then growing in confidence and hunger. Every brush of lips, every soft sigh, was a promise, an acknowledgement of mutual admiration and desire. We parted for air, foreheads resting together, our hearts racing in sync. We're writing our own story now, I murmured, feeling the exhilaration of freedom and the warmth of trust. Alistair smiled, a gleam of playfulness and shared understanding in his eyes. And it's one I intend to explore, every chapter, every line, he whispered. His hands cupped my face, tender but insistent, and I knew that this was more than romance. It was a partnership forged through intellect, trust, and mutual respect. Returning to my apartment later that evening, my manuscript felt lighter, fuller, imbued with the clarity of a life finally aligned with truth. And with Alistair in my life, every word I wrote carried the warmth and hunger of a love that was both gentle and fervent, a romance that was intellectual, emotional, and undeniably passionate. The afternoon sunlight spilled into my writing room, highlighting the pages of my manuscript like a golden halo. I was on a roll, words flowing in a torrent of honesty and liberation, when a knock at the door startled me. Before I could answer, Alistair's familiar figure leaned inside, holding a small stack of notes and a mischievous grin. "May I interrupt the genius at work?" he asked, voice low and teasing. I laughed softly, setting my pen down. "Only if you promise to contribute more than your smile this time." He entered, brushing past me in a way that sent a shiver down my spine, subtle but intentional. His presence filled the room, warm and grounding, and I realized just how much I craved it, not just physically but emotionally. The manuscript might have been my liberation, but he was the anchor of it. He settled across from me, pulling out his notes, and for a while, we sat in comfortable silence, reviewing plot twists, character arcs, and narrative beats. But even amidst the discussion, there was an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull that neither of us could ignore. His gaze lingered longer than necessary, brushing against my skin in a way that made my pulse quicken. I found my thoughts drifting, the manuscript fading slightly as the heat between us grew. My hand brushed his across the table, casual at first, then deliberately, and he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened around mine, and a quiet electricity sparked through me. "You know," he murmured, leaning closer, his breath warm against my ear, "I've been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending I'm just here to critique your work." I swallowed hard, the words stirring something primal and liberating. "And now," I whispered, heart racing. "Now," he said, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, a feather-light, teasing touch that made my knees feel weak. He leaned back slightly, giving me a moment to catch my breath, but the promise in his eyes was undeniable. I stood, drawn to him by an invisible thread, and he rose to meet me halfway. The space between us disappeared in an instant, replaced by warmth, urgency, and the undeniable pull of desire. His hands found my waist, holding me close, while mine tangled in his hair, feeling the familiar, grounding texture that had become my sanctuary. Our lips met, first softly, exploring, testing, and then with a hunger that had been building over weeks of stolen glances and quiet mentorship. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation in itself, passionate, urgent, and filled with the trust that had blossomed between us. Every movement, every sigh, was a declaration of the intimacy that had been growing quietly, now finally unleashed. We broke apart just long enough to gasp for air, foreheads resting together, breaths mingling. "I've wanted this for so long," I admitted, my voice trembling with honesty and relief. "Me too," he replied, voice husky, hands still holding me as if letting go was impossible. "Every word you've written, every moment you've spent building your story, it's brought us here. I want to explore every chapter of us, every line of this life together." I laughed softly, a mixture of joy and relief, and kissed him again, slower this time, savoring the warmth, the safety, and the fire all at once. His hands roamed gently but insistently, tracing lines of familiarity that had been missing from my life for far too long. The connection was electric, yet tender, a perfect reflection of the balance we had found, passion grounded in trust, intimacy rooted in mutual respect. Later, we curled together on the couch, pages of my manuscript spread around us, notes and edits forgotten. His arm draped over my shoulders, mine intertwined with his, and we whispered words of encouragement, playful teasing, and shared excitement for the work ahead. The fire between us burned, not just in desire, but in the shared triumph of authenticity and emotional liberation. For the first time, I felt completely seen, understood, and desired, not as a project, not as a muse, but as a whole person, unafraid to embrace both intellect and passion. And in that quiet, golden afternoon, amidst the pages and the promises, I knew that this was more than romance. It was a rebirth, a new story finally written in the language of truth and love. The morning sunlight poured through the large bay windows of my apartment, illuminating stacks of manuscripts, notebooks, and loose pages that smelled faintly of coffee and ink. Today was the day I would finally finish the novel that had both tormented and liberated me. The rebirth I'd experienced, learning to confront my own emotional truths, breaking free from Elias's calculated narrative, and finally embracing my voice, had carried me to this moment. Alistair was beside me, perched on the edge of the sofa with his usual quiet, confident energy. His presence was steadying, a grounding force as I read aloud the last chapter. Every word I spoke felt like a declaration of independence, of passion, of the life I was reclaiming for myself. He listened intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a thoughtful suggestion, but mostly just being there, supportive, attentive, and utterly present. When I reached the final paragraph, a surge of triumph and relief washed over me. I set the pen down, feeling the weight of months of struggle lift from my shoulders. "It's done," I whispered, almost in disbelief. Alistair leaned forward, placing a hand over mine. "It's brilliant," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made my chest ache in the best possible way. "You've not only written a story, you've reclaimed yourself. Every line, every character, every challenge, they all mirror your strength." I smiled, heart fluttering, and looked into his eyes. There was something different today, something electric yet tender, a quiet acknowledgement of what we had discovered together. Slowly, I leaned toward him, and he met me halfway. Our lips touched, first softly, testing, and then with a hunger that had been building quietly over weeks of shared vulnerability and collaboration. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, passion, and the comfort of knowing someone sees you completely. He pulled me closer, and my hands slid around his neck as the room seemed to disappear around us. The kiss deepened, a perfect balance of longing and gentleness, a culmination of all the suppressed emotions, the silent support, the stolen glances that had marked the early days of our connection. I felt his fingers tracing along my spine, sending shivers down my body, while his lips moved with purpose and patience. We broke apart only to rest our foreheads together, breaths mingling. I never imagined finishing this book would feel like this, I admitted, my voice trembling with exhilaration. "Nor did I," he said, his tone warm, low, and almost reverent. "But you've shown me something, Freya. The courage to face the truth, the willingness to embrace passion and intellect together, it's rare. And I want every chapter of your life to be written with that same honesty. With me by your side, if you'll have me." My heart skipped. There was no pretense, no calculated plan, only the raw, tender promise of a shared future. I nodded, leaning in for another kiss, this one slower, hungrier, and yet infinitely gentle. Every lingering touch, every shared breath, was a reaffirmation of trust and desire. Later, we sat together at the desk, not out of necessity but choice, reviewing my manuscript one final time. Alistair read aloud passages, his voice steady and encouraging, and I watched him as he smiled at the words I had fought so hard to birth. There was a rhythm to our collaboration, a harmony that extended far beyond writing. It was life itself, shared and real, untainted by the manipulations I had endured with Elias. By evening, the novel was ready for submission. I sent the final file, a mix of triumph, relief, and anticipation coursing through me. Alistair raised his hand in a mock toast, and I laughed, brushing my fingers against his. "I can't wait to see how the world responds," I said. "Nor can I," he replied, pulling me close once more. "But no matter what happens out there, here and now, this is ours." And in that moment, amidst the pages and promises, the manuscript and the shared quiet, I understood something I had long forgotten. True rebirth isn't just about reclaiming your voice. It's about finding someone who hears it, values it, and matches it with honesty, devotion, and passion. I leaned into him, pressing a final, lingering kiss to his lips, feeling the warmth, the solidity, and the unshakable trust between us. I had survived betrayal, reclaimed my life, and discovered a love that was as gentle as it was consuming. My story was finally complete, and so was this chapter of my life.